The gulls screamed overhead, their cries carrying across the gray Atlantic morning. Clara Whitmore stood barefoot on the weathered porch of her grandparents' cedar-sided house, the sea wind tugging her hair into her face. At the foot of the steps, a moving truck idled, engine rumbling like a threat. 3 men in work gloves waited with boxes and dollies, glancing uneasily between the clipboards in their hands and the family drama unfolding before them. "Friday," her brother Spencer barked, slapping a folded set of papers against his palm. "You're out by Friday, Clara. This place belongs to us now. Don't make it ugly." Their parents flanked him, Gordon, his jaw tight with a smug grin, and Valerie, already wearing the triumphant look of someone who thought the fight was over before it began. It would have rattled anyone else. A full-scale ambush, complete with movers, legal threats, and the weight of family betrayal pressing down like a tide. But Clara simply leaned against the porch railing, the boards creaking beneath her, and gave a small smile. She didn't shout, didn't argue. Her stillness was unnerving, like a chess player who had already seen the last move unfold 10 turns ahead. This was no accident. For years, she had suspected that the day would come when greed marched right up her front steps. She had watched their appetites grow like unchecked vines, twisting tighter each time her grandparents' health faltered. They never came to share soup on winter nights or to shovel snow from the walkway. But now, with Edgar and Lillian gone, they arrived armed with bluster and paperwork. The movers shifted uncomfortably. Even they sensed that something wasn't adding up. What daughter greets her family's attempt to evict her with calm defiance, almost amusement? Clara's hand rested lightly on the locket at her throat, the one her grandmother had pressed into her palm before the end. Inside was no photograph, only a folded slip of paper with a date scrawled in blue ink, the date she had placed every asset, including this weather-beaten house above the cliffs, into a trust that could not be touched. She looked from her brother to her parents and finally said, "If you think a stack of forged papers and a rented truck can bulldoze the truth, you haven't been paying attention. You're standing on my ground, and you don't even know it yet." The words hung in the salt air, sharper than the cry of the gulls. Spencer faltered for a beat, then sneered, shoving the documents toward her as if proximity alone could make them real. But Clara did not reach for them. She only folded her arms and let silence do the work. Silence thick enough to make even the movers glance back at the restless sea, as though it knew the outcome already. What no one but Clara understood in that moment was that this confrontation was less about papers and more about legacy. Her grandparents had built their lives on honest work and quiet dignity, brick by brick, nail by nail. This home was more than timber and shingles. It was a testament to love that survived storms, and Clara had vowed it would never become another casualty of greed. For the viewers, picture this. The sea foaming at the cliff's edge, a young woman alone against her entire bloodline, outnumbered and seemingly outpowered. Yet she stands unmoved, harboring a secret card that will flip the game completely. It is the kind of moment that makes you lean closer to the screen, whispering to yourself, what does she know that they don't? Stay with me, because what unfolds from this porch, this battle line drawn in salt air and old cedar, will not just decide who claims a house. It will decide who truly honors family and who mistakes inheritance for entitlement. And hey, if this story already has your heart pounding, make sure you drop a comment about what you would have said standing on that porch, share it with someone who believes in fighting for what's right, and of course, subscribe so you don't miss how Clara turns the tables. Trust me, you'll want to see every twist.
The house on the cliff hadn't always been a battlefield.
Long before movers rumbled into the driveway and forged documents waved like weapons, it had been a sanctuary of warmth and order. Clara could still remember summers spent on the wide front porch with her grandfather Edgar, his weathered hands whittling tiny sailboats from driftwood while the tide rolled in and out like an eternal lullaby. Her grandmother Lillian filled the kitchen with the smell of cardamom bread, her laughter ringing against the cedar walls. This was the soil Clara's roots sank into, not the shallow, shifting ground of her parents' greed. Gordon and Valerie Whitmore had always been drifters, chasing schemes in the city, pitching get-rich-quick ventures that collapsed as fast as they were dreamed up. To them, money was something to be seized, manipulated, displayed. To Edgar and Lillian, wealth was quiet stability, a paid-off home, a warm meal, a promise kept. Clara had felt that difference from an early age. She was left on the porch steps of this house when she was 6, abandoned by parents who claimed they were pursuing opportunities. Edgar scooped her up without hesitation, and from that moment, she became theirs. She learned to mend fishing nets alongside her grandfather and pressed flowers into thick journals with her grandmother. These were simple lessons, yet beneath them ran deeper truths. Work mattered, people mattered, promises mattered. In town, the Whitmores were respected as pillars of decency. Edgar's booming laugh filled the harbor, and Lillian's quiet wisdom soothed neighbors through their darkest winters. Clara walked behind them, soaking up their values the way sea mist clings to skin. But those same neighbors also knew the other Whitmores, the ones who only drifted back to town when they smelled opportunity. Gordon would flash his too-slick smile, Valerie would drop hints about big investments, and Spencer, even as a teenager, would brag about what he deserved simply for being born. Clara hated the way their presence disrupted the harmony her grandparents had built. She could feel their eyes on the house, on the carefully kept furniture, even on the land that overlooked the water. And though Edgar never spoke harshly of his son, the disappointment sometimes flickered across his face, like storm clouds briefly dimming the sun. Still, Clara grew in the shelter of her grandparents' values. She excelled in school, not from pressure, but from encouragement. Lillian's hand on her shoulder, Edgar's clap on her back, those gestures meant more than any inheritance could. By the time she earned her scholarship to study law in Chicago, she carried with her not just ambition, but a compass calibrated to integrity. It was that compass that made the betrayal years later so sharp. Because Clara wasn't just defending a house of cedar and glass windows. She was defending the memory of 2 people who had sacrificed everything for her. Her parents' arrival with forged papers wasn't just a property dispute, it was a desecration. Imagine her standing there on that porch, feeling not only the salt wind, but also the weight of every lesson Edgar and Lillian had ever given her. The movers, the neighbors, even Spencer with his smug grin. They didn't understand the fire that smoldered beneath Clara's calm. They hadn't lived the countless evenings when Edgar told her, "We take care of what we're given, Clara. We protect it, even when it's hard." As the sun dipped lower that day, Clara's mind rewound through decades of belonging, of love, of stability given freely by people who owed her nothing. And because of that history, she knew one thing with certainty. This fight was not about greed versus greed. It was about right versus wrong. It was about preserving the values that had raised her from abandoned child to woman strong enough to stand against her own blood. The crowd on the lawn couldn't see all that, but Clara could feel her grandparents in the very beams of the house, urging her to stand tall, and that knowledge was sharper than any legal document her family could wave in her face. Chicago had been a shock to Clara's system. Gone were the salt-kissed breezes and the predictable crash of waves. Instead, the city roared with car horns and train brakes, neon lights flickering above crowded sidewalks. Clara arrived with 2 battered suitcases, a scholarship letter in her pocket, and her grandparents' voices echoing in her mind. Work hard, stay honest, protect what matters. Law school was grueling. Long nights hunched over casebooks left her fingers stained with ink and her mind heavy with doctrines. Yet, in the exhaustion, Clara found a strange clarity. She wasn't drawn to corporate law or flashy trial work like many classmates. What gripped her were the stories hidden in probate cases, in guardianship hearings, in bitter fights over wills. She sat in courtrooms where adult children argued over houses while frail parents trembled in the witness box. She saw bank accounts drained by caregivers who weren't family at all, and siblings tearing each other apart over heirlooms. One case stayed with her, the Wilson family. An elderly widow, Mrs. Wilson, had trusted her nephew to manage her estate. By the time the matter reached court, her Victorian home had been sold, her savings siphoned into shell companies, and she was left living in a nursing home with nothing but fading photographs. Clara remembered sitting in the back of that courtroom, fists clenched, thinking of Lillian's gentle voice and Edgar's steady presence. That could be them. That could be us. From that day forward, Clara specialized in elder law. She pored over statutes, memorized trust structures, and grilled professors on legal protections. Her classmates teased her for being the trust and estates girl, but she didn't care. She had seen too much, and deep down she knew her own family was capable of the same kind of theft. So in her final year, long before Edgar's heart condition worsened or Lillian's memory began to fade, Clara quietly met with a senior attorney she trusted. Together, they drafted an irrevocable trust. The house, the savings, even Edgar's old fishing boat, all of it was transferred into the structure. Edgar and Lillian kept full control while they lived, but upon their passing, the assets would bypass Clara's parents and Spencer completely. The documents were airtight, witnessed, and filed. When she flew home for Christmas break, snow crunching under her boots as she stepped onto the porch, she carried the trust in a sealed envelope. She sat Edgar and Lillian down at the kitchen table. He looked skeptical at first, but she explained it all in careful detail. The protections, the legal safeguards, the shield it created against exploitation. Lillian's eyes welled with tears as she touched Clara's hand. "You've thought of everything," she whispered. She didn't tell them the darker truth, that she had envisioned her own parents wielding forged wills or bullying her into signing away rights. She didn't need to. They trusted her judgment, and that was enough. The papers were signed that night while the wood stove crackled and snow fell heavy against the window panes. For Clara, it wasn't more than paperwork. It was a silent vow. She would never allow her grandparents' legacy to be stolen, not while she drew breath. If greed came knocking, it would find a wall of iron. Years later, standing on that porch with Spencer waving counterfeit documents, Clara's calm smile wasn't born of arrogance, it was born of preparation, of foresight, of a trust crafted in the quiet of a Chicago winter that had turned their entire estate into something untouchable. And as the movers shifted nervously by the truck, Clara's fingers brushed her locket again, remembering the date scrawled on the folded slip of paper inside, the day she had locked her family's future away from the claws of betrayal.
It started quietly, the way storms always do. Small warnings overlooked until the sky finally broke open. Edgar's color grew ashen one morning at the breakfast table, his hand trembling as he reached for his coffee. Within weeks, a cardiologist confirmed what Clara feared. His heart was weakening, the years of hauling nets and braving icy winds now demanding their toll. Around the same time, Lillian began misplacing small things, her reading glasses, the sugar tin, even once, her wedding ring. At first, it seemed harmless, a symptom of age, but the lapses grew sharper, her sentences trailing into confusion, her eyes sometimes blank with panic. For Clara, each doctor's appointment felt like a stone added to her chest. She drove them to checkups, filled pill boxes, soothed late-night anxieties, and she did it with quiet devotion, because these were the people who had raised her when no one else would. But as Clara's love tightened its grip, her parents' sudden concern arrived like vultures circling a weakening animal. Gordon and Valerie began appearing at the house more often, their smiles too wide, their voices laced with practiced sympathy. "We just want to help," they said, bringing store-bought casseroles and hovering at the kitchen table. Clara saw through it instantly. These were not gestures of love. They were reconnaissance missions. Spencer, now older but no less entitled, slouched through the hallways pretending to check in on his grandparents, but his eyes lingered on drawers, on cabinets, on the old roll-top desk Edgar kept locked. One evening, as Clara stepped out of her room, she caught Spencer in the study with a flashlight, rifling through files. She didn't confront him, at least not then. Instead, she stood silently in the shadows, phone raised, recording every whispered word as Spencer muttered about wills, deeds, and how the old folks won't know the difference. That recording became her secret weapon. But in the moment, her heart ached more than it raged. How could someone who shared her blood speak with such cold calculation about the very people who had given them shelter? The following weeks grew heavier. Edgar's hospital visits increased, and Lillian sometimes wandered the house at night, murmuring to long-departed relatives. Clara never faltered in her care, but she noticed Gordon slipping away with manila folders, Valerie pressing too many questions about financial accounts. She began locking important documents in her room, installing a small camera in the study, and documenting every suspicious action. It was exhausting, but Clara knew she had to stay vigilant. One night, standing in the kitchen with rain hammering against the windows, she overheard her parents and Spencer arguing in hushed but heated tones. They spoke of getting it all sorted before Edgar goes and making sure Clara doesn't interfere. Her blood ran cold. She hit record on her phone again, capturing every venom-laced syllable. The betrayal wasn't a maybe anymore. It was an active plot. For the viewers, picture Clara in that moment, pressed against the hallway wall, her phone shaking in her hand, her family just a room away conspiring to strip everything from the people she loved most. It's the kind of scene that makes you hold your breath, waiting to see if the creak of a floorboard will give her away. By the time dawn came, Clara's resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. She knew the trust she had built years ago was secure, but now she had something even more potent, a proof of their intentions, a recording that stripped away the mask of false concern. From then on, every glance across the dinner table felt like a silent duel. They plotted, she prepared. They whispered, she documented. Edgar and Lillian, in their frailty, couldn't see the storm brewing, but Clara could feel the thunder rolling closer with every passing day. And deep down, she understood. Love might demand sleepless nights and endless worry, but it also demanded defense. She would not let the vultures win.
Grief has a strange way of folding time. For Clara, the weeks after Edgar's passing felt like one long twilight, where clocks ticked but never seemed to move forward. She had been there in the hospital when his chest rose for the last time, her fingers wrapped around his calloused hand. "I'm here, Grandpa," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her anymore. And then, only weeks later, Lillian slipped away too, her frail voice drifting into silence as though she had been waiting for Edgar to lead the way. 2 funerals in one season, it felt cruel, unbearable. Neighbors came bearing flowers and casseroles. Old fishermen gathered at the dock, removing their caps in solemn tribute. Clara kept her composure, thanking everyone, shaking hands, bowing her head. But when the house emptied and night returned, she sat in their favorite chairs, surrounded by photographs and the faint smell of Edgar's pipe tobacco, and let the tears come in waves,
The house echoed with absence. And yet, while Clara grieved, the others plotted. Gordon and Valerie appeared almost immediately after the funerals, as if grief were an invitation. Their tone dripped with false sympathy. "We'll help you sort things, Clara," Valerie said one afternoon, patting her shoulder while her eyes scanned the walls, the furniture, the shelves stacked with heirlooms. Gordon, with his usual swagger, muttered about taking responsibility for the estate and making sure things are handled properly. Spencer said little, but his smirk told Clara everything. They weren't here to console. They were here to collect. Clara had expected this. For years she had seen the hunger in their eyes, masked poorly by polite words. That's why she had prepared. Still, the brazenness stung. Her parents were barely laid to rest, and already they spoke as though the house and everything in it were theirs. Late at night, Clara spread her papers across the kitchen table. Copies of the trust Edgar and Lillian had signed, notarized statements, her carefully kept recordings of Spencer whispering about taking it all before the old folks are gone. She had cameras installed, locks changed, lawyers on call. Every detail had been anticipated. But the anticipation didn't numb the ache. She wished more than anything that her grandparents were still alive to laugh at her parents' absurd greed, to sit at the head of the table and remind them all what family was supposed to mean. The night before the inevitable clash, Clara sat alone, the storm outside battering the windows. A candle flickered on the table, casting shadows across her notes. She fingered the locket around her neck, a gift from Lillian when she turned 18. Inside was a tiny photo of the three of them together, her, Edgar, and Lillian, smiling in front of the old Victorian home. She whispered, voice breaking, "I won't let them take this from us. Not now. Not ever." At dawn, Clara was already at the courthouse. She walked into the clerk's office with Marcus Tate, her attorney, a seasoned man with gray at his temples and a sharp sense of justice. Together, they filed the emergency injunction. By noon, a judge signed the temporary restraining order. By evening, Clara held the document in her hands, her shield. Her parents could bluster, but the law was on her side. That night, she finally allowed herself a fragile moment of release. She cried into the silence, not just for her grandparents, but for herself, for the child who had once craved her parents' love, and for the woman who now stood ready to battle them. When her sobs quieted, she looked at the folder on the table and steadied her breath. The trust wasn't just legal paperwork. It was her grandparents' final gift, a fortress they had unknowingly built with her. And so, when the moving truck pulled into the driveway days later, Clara didn't flinch. She heard the engine before she saw the familiar silhouettes stepping out, faces painted with arrogance and anticipation. But she wasn't the fragile caretaker they imagined. She was battle-tested, armored with law, and ready to meet them on her own terms. The porch creaked beneath her as she stepped forward, sunlight glinting off the brass key in her hand. Her voice was calm, almost steady. "You won't win this time."
The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of sea salt and damp cedar as the moving truck ground to a halt in front of the house. Its tires crushed gravel with a finality that made Clara's pulse quicken. Gordon was the first to step out, his chest puffed as though he were returning to claim a throne. Valerie followed, her heels clicking against the driveway like a judge's gavel. Spencer brought up the rear, sunglasses perched arrogantly on his nose despite the gray sky. They didn't even glance at Clara at first. Gordon barked at the movers to start unloading, while Valerie handed one of them a folded document with an air of triumph. "The will is clear," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This property belongs to us now."
Clara stood at the top of the porch steps, hands clasped loosely in front of her, her expression unreadable. The movers hesitated, eyes darting between the sharp-faced woman waving papers and the calm young woman blocking the doorway. "Good morning," Clara finally said, her voice steady. "I hope you didn't waste too much money renting that truck." Spencer smirked. "Step aside, Clara. We've got legal authority. You're squatting." At that, Clara let out a small, almost pitying laugh. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a neat folder, its edges crisp and corners squared. From inside, she withdrew a thick packet stamped with the court's seal. "Funny you mention legal authority, because a judge signed this 2 days ago." She held the document high enough for everyone, including the movers and 2 curious neighbors leaning over their fence, to see. "It's a restraining order. You have no right to this house, no right to these belongings, and no right to harass me here. You tried to set 1 foot inside, and you'll be in contempt of court." Gordon's face went red, his voice booming. "You can't wave some paper around and think it'll stick. The will is irrelevant," Clara cut in sharply, her voice ringing louder than she expected. "The estate was transferred into an irrevocable trust years ago, before either of you bothered to show your faces. And this," she tapped the court order, "proves it. Everything you think you're entitled to, it's out of your reach." The movers, suddenly uneasy, froze mid-step with a dresser in their hands. One of them whispered to the other, "We're not touching this." They slid the dresser back into the truck and waited. Valerie tried to recover her composure, flipping her hair and narrowing her eyes. "This isn't over. You can't hide behind paperwork forever." Clara tilted her head, her tone cool. "This isn't hiding. It's protecting what was entrusted to me, what they left in my care. And I have proof you knew about the trust all along, proof you tried to sabotage it." Spencer shifted uncomfortably, the smirk fading. "She's bluffing," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Clara didn't need to argue further. Instead, she pulled a small device from her bag and pressed play. Out came Spencer's voice, unmistakable, recorded weeks earlier. "Once they're gone, we'll push her out. That trust is just a piece of paper. We'll find a way around it. We just need to act fast." The blood drained from his face. Valerie gasped, eyes darting at her son in horror, while Gordon's rage sputtered into silence. "You see," Clara said, raising her chin, "I don't bluff. I prepare." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the cry of a gull overhead. The neighbors exchanged glances. The movers set down the last of their cargo and folded their arms, waiting for instructions. Clara looked at them and said clearly, "They won't be moving anything today. This house isn't theirs." It wasn't just a statement of fact. It was a declaration of victory.
The sun sat heavy above the cliffs that afternoon, spilling pale light across the sea. The house looked almost golden in its glow, though inside Clara's chest there was nothing but storm. The moving truck still idled at the curb, its engine grumbling like an impatient beast. Gordon had stepped forward, jaw tight, fists balled at his sides. And for the first time, Clara realized he wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was desperate. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" Gordon barked, pointing a finger at her chest. "We'll appeal. We'll drag you into every courtroom in the state until you cave. You're still a child, Clara. You're nothing without us." The words might once have cut her, but not now. Clara drew a breath, steadying herself against the railing of the porch. "You had every chance to be something to me. When I was sick, when I was hungry, when I begged for help, you turned your back. Edgar and Lillian didn't. They fed me, they held me, they loved me. I'm not nothing. I'm everything they wanted me to be. And that terrifies you." The neighbors across the street had gathered quietly, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. One woman shook her head, her arms crossed, while another man muttered, "Shameful." Clara knew Gordon and Valerie could hear them, and the knowledge stung them more than any court order. Valerie, desperate to salvage control, slipped on her practiced smile and softened her tone. "Clara, sweetheart, we're family. We can work this out privately. Think about how this looks. Do you really want to cut us out of your life? People will talk." That word, family, curdled in Clara's stomach. She fingered the silver locket at her throat, feeling the edges of the tiny photo inside. Family isn't blood. It's love. It's sacrifice. It's showing up. You gave that up a long time ago. Spencer, restless and sweating under his sunglasses, finally snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing for Clara's arm. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then a car door slammed. Marcus Tate strode across the yard, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. "I wouldn't advise that," Marcus said, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. "There's a sheriff waiting on my call. Touch her and you'll be in cuffs before dinner." Spencer's hand froze midair before he yanked it back. His bravado collapsed like a paper mask in the rain. Clara gave Marcus a grateful nod, then turned her gaze back to her parents. Gordon's face had gone scarlet, his breathing ragged. Valerie's smile was gone, her lips pressed into a thin line. Their plan was crumbling, and they knew it. You can scream, you can threaten, but the law isn't on your side. The neighbors see the truth, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. The movers, who had been waiting awkwardly by the truck, finally began sliding the dresser back into place. One of them muttered, "We're not touching this mess." They climbed into the cab, leaving Gordon and Valerie stranded in their own humiliation. "You'll regret this," Gordon spat, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "No," Clara said softly, but firmly. "For once, it is." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the silence that followed. Valerie grabbed Gordon's arm, hissing something Clara couldn't hear. Spencer kept his eyes down, shoulders hunched, shame heavy on his frame. One by one, they retreated. First to the truck, then inside, doors slamming with angry finality. Moments later, the vehicle roared away, its noise fading down the winding road. Clara stood alone on the porch, the sea wind tugging at her hair. The house behind her felt different now, almost lighter, as though Edgar and Lillian themselves had been standing guard through the ordeal. She lifted her face to the sky, closing her eyes. "We did it. They can't touch us anymore." The gulls answered with shrill cries above, the waves hammering the cliffs in steady applause. For the first time since the funerals, Clara felt something fragile but undeniable rising in her chest. Peace. Not victory, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that she had defended the love that raised her. And that was enough. The silence that followed their departure felt unreal, like the pause after a thunderstorm when the world holds its breath. Clara lingered on the porch, her fingers brushing the old wood of the railing, grounding herself. For weeks, she had been in a battle she never asked for, a war of papers and threats. And yet, here she was, standing, unbroken. Marcus closed his briefcase with a snap and joined her at the steps. "They won't come back anytime soon," he said, his voice firm. "The trust is airtight, the restraining order solid. They've got nothing left but empty threats." Clara nodded, but her throat tightened anyway. "I thought I'd feel happier, but all I feel is tired." "That's what happens when you fight for something worth keeping," Marcus said gently. He looked out at the neighbors still watching from across the street. "Though I'd say you've won more than just a case. You've shown people who you are." And indeed, the neighbors
The neighbors gave her small nods, sympathetic smiles, little gestures of respect. Where once she feared whispers, now she felt seen. Inside the house, every picture frame, every creak in the floorboard carried memories of Edgar and Lillian. Clara walked through the living room, running her hands over the mantel where her grandmother used to line seashells collected from the nearby beach. She whispered a quiet promise. "I kept it safe for you." That night, Clara sat at her desk, spreading out her plans. She could sell the house, maybe move on. But no, it wasn't about the property. It was about the love and lessons she'd been given here. Instead, she chose something bolder. She began drafting documents for the Edgar and Lillian Harper Scholarship, aimed at supporting young students in law and elder care. Their legacy would reach beyond the cliffs, beyond this home, into futures they could never have imagined. Days later, Valerie sent a brief email. Just a few lines. "I didn't realize how far we'd gone. I'm sorry for my part." Clara read it once, twice, but didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't denial, but she wasn't ready to bridge that gap. Sometimes peace meant closing doors, not reopening them. Spencer never contacted her. Gordon, predictably, tried one last desperate maneuver, a half-hearted lawsuit tossed out by the judge before it even reached trial. It was a whimper, not a roar, and Clara barely gave it a thought. In the weeks that followed, Clara discovered something unexpected. She wasn't alone. Friends, colleagues, even some of the neighbors who had once been strangers began to reach out. They brought food, shared stories, and treated her not as the embattled orphan, but as a woman who had chosen strength. Slowly, she built her chosen family, one born not of blood, but of care. The house no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt alive again. She hosted dinners in the old dining room, laughter echoing against the walls that once held only grief. She planted a garden with flowers her grandmother had loved, their colors spilling across the yard in a riot of resilience. Clara had not just defended a home, she had defended a legacy. And now, she was ready to live it. The weeks rolled into months, and slowly, the wounds of battle faded into scars of strength. Clara would often sit on the porch in the early evenings, tea warming her hands, the sea stretching endlessly before her. The house no longer felt heavy with fear. It thrummed with life again, with laughter and the comforting hum of belonging. The scholarship in Edgar and Lillian's name gained momentum quickly. Students wrote letters of gratitude, some even visiting to thank Clara personally. Each story reminded her why she fought so hard. She hadn't just preserved a house, she had preserved hope. Their names would live on, etched not only in memory, but in the futures of those they had quietly inspired. Clara knew there would always be shadows. Gordon's bitter curses, Valerie's hollow apologies, Spencer's silence. But those shadows no longer defined her. Instead, they highlighted the light she chose to build. The family that abandoned her had tried to strip her of everything, but in losing them, she found her truest inheritance: courage, community, and love. One evening, as gulls circled above and waves kissed the rocks below, Clara whispered into the salt wind, "I kept my promise, and I'll keep it, always." A peace deeper than victory settled in her chest, a quiet triumph that no court battle, no betrayal could ever erase. She was no longer the frightened girl waiting for affection that never came. She was the woman who stood firm, who defended what mattered, who turned grief into legacy. Her story wasn't one of survival, it was one of becoming. And now, to those who've walked this journey with me, yes, you, listening right now, let Clara's fight remind you, family isn't always who shares your blood, but who stands with you in the storm. Protect what matters.
stand your ground, and when the time comes, write your own ending. If Clara's story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about the moment that moved you most, and share it with someone who needs strength today. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories that remind us what resilience truly looks like. Because sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones won quietly within the walls of our own hearts.